everyone for coming out today. I just wanted to thank Jenna as well for all her help organizing this panel. So this panel has come together on the occasion of Other Primary Structures, curated by Jens Hoffman, and with help from Johanna Montoya, who's assistant curator at the Jewish Museum. And it's a revisitation of the 1966 exhibition, Primary Structures, which was curated by Kynaston McShine and also held at the Jewish Museum. So this show, the original was among the first to bring together a group of artists that would be associated with what has been referred to as minimalism, but which also blurred and diverged into post-minimalism and conceptual art. Through these considerations of art in the 1960s, new ways of thinking through material, space, industry, architecture, and the body dominated. While the original Primary Structures featured artists mostly from the US and UK, it became known that there was artwork that could be considered in dialogue with primarily US and European construction of minimalism that was taking place globally. As this exhibition reveals, in South America, artists were already working with particular conceptions of form and space that touch on relationships between architecture and industry through what was called neoconcretism, which came from a history of constructivism and geometric abstraction. And then you also have Manoha in Japan, which came on the heels of Gutai, where artists were working, which makes clear that artists were working with specific, shared, and misinterpreted art histories on a global scale. Thus, Other Primary Structures underscores the range and reach of art that dealt with minimalist tendencies, as well as a consideration of global art histories and exchange. So to address the legacies of these histories and a range of perspectives today, we have a group of fantastic artists who each briefly discuss their work. And following their presentations, I'll moderate a short discussion with them, and then we'll open up with questions from the audience. So now to introduce our fine panelists. Next to me, Erin Shirreff, who lives and works in New York. Her recent exhibitions include Never Enough, Dallas Museum of Art, Repertory, Palazzo Cavour, Turin, Lens Drawings, Marian Goodman Gallery, Paris, The Camera's Blind Spot, Museo d'Arte de Noro, Lost Line at LACMA, Los Angeles, and Once Removed at the Yale University Art Gallery. Her work is in the collections of the Guggenheim Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Centre Pompidou, among others. Charles Harlan is a Brooklyn-based sculptor who works with wood, stone, and industrial materials to reinterpret the constructions that envelop us. By isolating archetypal forms within mundane materials, Harlan mines the hidden poetics of everyday objects. Recent solo exhibitions include Ishtar at Venus over Manhattan, Gate at Karma, New York, and Basin at JTT. He's been the recipient of an Emerging Artist Fellowship from Socrates Sculpture Park and a Chancellor's Grant from New York University. Allyson Vieira's work has been recently featured in a solo exhibition at the Kunsthalle Basel in September 2013, which then traveled to the Swiss Institute in New York. Her work has also been shown at Non-Objectif Sud in Toulette, France, Monica de Cardenas in Milan, and The Breeder in Athens, Greece. In 2013, she exhibited public work at the Metrotech Center in Brooklyn, commissioned by Public Art Fund, and on the High Line. Her work has been included in group exhibitions at the Santa Barbara Contemporary Arts Forum, the Queens Museum, SculptureCenter, and Deitch Projects. Carissa Rodriguez has received solo exhibitions at Karma International Zurich, Swiss Institute New York, House of Gaga in Mexico City, and New Jersey and Basel. Group exhibitions, including her work, have appeared at White Columns in New York, SculptureCenter, Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Kunsthalle Zurich, Gavin Brown's Enterprise New York, Elizabeth D. Gallery New York, and the Green Naftali Gallery in New York. Her work co-created with Arakawa was included in the 2014 Whitney Biennial. And then Daniel Steegmann Mangrané was born in Barcelona and currently lives in Rio de Janeiro. His solo exhibitions have taken place at the Crac Centre d'Art Contemporain in Alsace, Altrecht coming up in October 2014, Sipo Tabo Yivi at Casa Franca, Brazil in Rio, and Bicho de Nariz Delicado at Uma Certa Falta in Porto, Portugal. His work has featured in group exhibitions at CRAC, Centre d'Art Contemporain, Renaissance Society in Chicago, Museo d'Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo, and Universidad Nacional Autónoma in Mexico. So I guess we can start with Erin.
Sure. Can you pass me the remote?
Yes.
Hi. So I just put together quickly 5 slides. And just as a brief introduction, I work in 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions, and also with video and film. But I just sort of end up merging the mediums. So these are tabletop maquettes that I have made specifically to photograph. These works are, I don't know, like this big. The tabletop maquettes are about this big, but there's a sort of ambiguity in the scale when you see the actual works. The photographs are spliced down the center. There's down there. And the pieces are folded in the frame, so they sort of resemble book spreads. Here's another one. These works are called AP. I think the sort of disjunction of the form is revealed pretty quickly, but they also sort of work as discrete objects as well. I guess I won't really go into anything beyond physical descriptions of the work at this point, just to keep things moving. But these are sculptures that I made. They're of using wood ash, and plaster. They're about, I think you can tell, probably about 1 inch or 1.5 inches thick, and they're very shell-like. They're made to be lit with a single spotlight, so the shadow completes the form. This is a series called Shadows. And this is a video that sort of a long duration video, part of a 2-part video projection piece that I've been working on for the last little while. This is Donald Judd's concrete buildings that are in the Chinati Foundation in Marfa. And these videos that I've been making for the last while are assembled from hundreds and hundreds of still images that are then sort of sequenced together in a video editing software, and the re-photograph nature of the images is sort of, you're made aware of the sort of mediation of the image at various times over the course of these sort of very minimal videos as they progress. The experience that I think viewers have when you see this work is sort of entering into the space of the image and then sort of being reminded of the sort of thingness of the image that you're looking at. Maybe I was too fast, but is that? I think that's okay. All right, that's it. Charles. Hey, I mean, I just think we're going to be here for all night if we keep going, right? So
Hi. I want to thank everyone at the Jewish Museum. And
come on. Yeah,
Ruba.
so do I.
Well, I feel, the list of artists here on the stage, it's an honor to be included and to talk about the work in the museum next door. So thank you. I don't really have anything prepared. I'm just going to describe the work. This is a vinyl siding cube. And it's 12 feet by 12 feet because vinyl siding comes in 12-foot sections. So it's sort of like a standard unit of vinyl siding. This is my first show at Jasmine's Gallery at JTT. We took the front off of the gallery and had a crane swing in this pipe that's 10 feet in diameter and 15 feet deep, and it kind of took up the whole space of the gallery. And I guess what I was thinking there was kind of how to do an outdoor sculpture show indoors. That's in the Lower East Side. And then this is outdoors at Socrates Sculpture Park. Those are 4 sonotubes filled with concrete casted into the ground. And then this is a show at Karma downtown that included, that's a roll gate, a steel roll gate like you see in the city, and a pile of gravel. There's another sonotube sculpture in the back with some rebar coming out, and a stack of 3 pallets with bricks and steel. And this is another pallets piece. I showed one like this in an art fair once, and the guy moving it on the forklift said it was like a bunch of Carl Andres stacked on top of each other. So it's kind of appropriate for tonight. And then this is from a show at Venus over Manhattan, which is a few blocks from here. I sort of reproduced a fence, corrugated steel fence that was across the street from my studio in Red Hook, and that's another steel roll gate, freestanding, that you could kind of walk around. I think that's, yeah, also very fast.
Okay, so I've done something strange with my chair. Excuse me. Sorry. So this image is from, all this work that I'm going to show you is all from the last year. So this image is from my last show at my gallery, Laurel Gitlin, in New York. And this is from last February. And I kind of sent some install shots, so you get a sense of how the works kind of work together as opposed to single works for the most part. In this shot, you can see there's a bunch of sculptures that are made from stacked drywall. So I've made, I'll just kind of describe how they were made. I made, cut a bunch of 16-inch squares of drywall and screwed them all together to create solids, to kind of create a new material that would be appropriate for, say, carving a figural sculpture or something like that. And then I worked them subtractively a bit to create forms that had a sense of contrapposto or weight-bearing. On top of each of those pairs, there's a 10 by 10 inch by 60 inch I-beam. So the drywall is supporting our posts, supporting a steel lintel. Each of those stacks of drywall is actually my height. So actually, like Charles, I deal with construction standards a lot, but I also try to incorporate my own proportions into the standard construction dimensions as well. And then the other piece you can see in the back is called Tower 1. I could just move the mic to me instead of moving my body to the mic, couldn't I? The piece in the back is called Tower 1. And it is cast plaster and concrete together. And it's hard to see because it's not a close-up, but if you ever get drywall delivered, if you're going to do renovations on your house or you're, building a studio or something like that, the drywall comes delivered to the sidewalk, and it comes on these kind of drywall studs that are made of the same material. It's like these long, skinny objects that are also made of the same material they're supporting. And so I took casts of those, and so these towers are actually made of casts of the kind of drywall support studs. And it kind of, I don't know if they're, if it's an icon tier or if it's sculptural niches or if it's a ziggurat or whatever. But, and on the ground you can see there's mylar that is rolled out, and it reflects the tower. It reflects it below ground, so it mirrors it through the kind of membrane of the floor. Where do I, okay. And so this is another install shot of a show that I did at Kunsthalle Basel last year. The works that you can see here, the two large structures are called the long walls, and they spanned the whole length of the gallery up there, which was probably about, oh God, I don't know, about 15 or 18 meters, 19, I think it was 19 meters. They're really long. It was a really long space. And so they're actually made of this kind of the steel studs that you use to build walls. And so they are set 16 inches apart, which is this kind of standard construction interval that you would use if you were to build walls. And they're proportioned to the architecture, but then they're kind of allowed to fall at the same time into, out against the walls. And it created it's hard to tell from the photo, but it creates kind of an S-shaped path through the space, where normally you would walk from one door diagonally to another. It created a very, very long path that kind of tripled the distance that you would have to walk through the space. But simultaneously, you could also, if you felt like it, actually walk through it. I mean, they were permeable. And the piece in the middle is called Beauty, Mirth, and Abundance. And that is made from Swiss module bricks, which are these kind of terracotta bricks that are used a lot in Europe. They're kind of like the European version of the cinder block in a way. They're super cheap and kind of flimsy, but they're produced a lot. They were used a lot to create what's kind of called the Neubauten, right? So it's the buildings that were built after the destruction of World War II. So these are the kind of the style of brick that's used for quick, fast, kind of cheap construction. And I carved all of the bricks into a representation or an approximation of the Roman sculpture from the Metropolitan Museum of the Three Graces, which is a really fantastic sculpture. The sculpture in the Metropolitan Museum they don't have heads. They're all kind of linked. Their bodies are these posts and their arms kind of connect. They're all holding each other, the Three Graces. And so their arms kind of connect into this support structure on the top, kind of creating almost a lintel through their mutual support of each other. The figures in the Metropolitan piece, I mean. But they have no heads. And so here I replaced their heads with a concrete drainage tube. This is also from the same show. You're kind of looking through the long walls now. And these are 6 of a series of works that it's a continuing series of work that I call Clad Sculptures. And they are made from the detritus of other works that I make. I kind of keep it all in buckets, and then as I'm making other works, I'm also always making these because I'm very interested in kind of making a new material or kind of a future material. What is the future material? What is kind of like the future geology or the future stone? And so I make a kind of amalgam of plaster and the kind of material detritus from the studio and create a new material out of that and kind of touch it lightly, sculpt it lightly, but really let the material kind of determine its own form. Here's a close-up of one of those. So, I mean, this was like 3 different moments that this was created in. You can see the top really looks like its own section, and then the middle kind of looks like has its own kind of stone pattern happening, and then the bottom also has its own thing going on. It's just what happened to be happening in the studio at that day. So these pieces also kind of create a semi-rational index of, or almost like a timeline of what else was going on in the studio at that time. This is my last slide. So I've also recently begun making videos and photos from those videos. In the show at Kunsthalle Basel that also was also at Swiss Institute just after, I had a video of the construction of the New World Trade Center. It's a static shot. It was about 25 minutes long or so. And I had it set up as a camera obscura, where in one room you could see the video. You could watch the video like you would watch a video, just on a loop. And there was an adjacent identical room, symmetrical, adjacent, and there was a pinhole in the wall. And so if you went into the second room, you could, and you were patient, you had to be patient, and you let your eyes adjust for about 5 to 10 minutes, you could watch the video play upside down in the kind of classic camera obscura fashion. And so these are prints, is a print series that was made in the camera obscura. So these are actually large-scale prints. They're about 1 meter by 2 meters, or 2 meters by 1 meter, made in that camera obscura from that. That's it.
Okay. I'm just going to talk about one work, because I think it's probably the most appropriate to your thematics. I'll show you the images real quick, and I'll read a description that I'd written a while ago. So, oops, go back. It's actually the process of having this work made. It was a piece that was for Positions in Art Basel in Miami 2011, which seems so long ago. Don't remember this. Where do I? Oh, yeah. That's the piece, a detail. This is okay, so I'll start from the beginning. Well, I didn't want to make a sculpture, but a problem within sculpture. And the work is called You Again. And it transposes the gift economy onto the ardent triangulated relationship between artist, dealer, and collector. I was invited by an art collector to create an artwork using his industrial enterprise, marble production, in exchange for letting me fabricate with his material and craftsman. He would be given an artwork of mine. And so the gesture in the work is to fuse the immaterial with the material, to fuse patronage as an intangible form of exchange with my own purchase of a ready-made tangible object in a singular artwork, with a ring purchased by myself and my representing gallery as a production cost, an object intended to signify love and commitment is put to work as an instrument of exchange. With the work, I'm examining how natural resources such as stone and metal are transformed into sentimental objects that are gifted, sold, and bartered for worth and affection. I'm looking at how value can fluctuate from the position of giving or receiving, which I would argue is a position that is never quite ungendered. And furthermore, in the work is a formal exploration that tests whether the Maussian theory of the gift can be applied here. The notion that states gifts are never free. In the economy of art, what can truly be unconditional? So the work, You Again, as a final artwork, is somewhat of a physical burden in its size, scale, and weight. It actually weighs 1 ton, and it was installed at SculptureCenter at a show that Ruba curated, and to get it out of the box is just like a whole production that costs thousands of dollars with riggers. And anyway, I don't usually make sculpture, and I was invited by this patron whose enterprise is marble, and I just thought like it was a chance to, I don't know, exploit something where you can make it really heavy and difficult, problematic, and the care of the work becomes the artwork somehow. Storage, I mean everything, the whole like just management of it is embedded. And so due to this, I opted for it's at an art fair, and yet, it was customized to fit the dimensions of the booth. I mean, I was invited to do a solo presentation there. And although it's on the marketplace, I opted to assign no monetary value, but rather to be offered as a gift to an interested collector whom I approve. So, in a sense, the work is free if I like you. In this way, the artist initiates the exchange, a reversal in some way of the order in which a sale usually unfolds. Marble, an earthy material inseparable from its institutional use and connotations, at once respectable and vulgar, attached to authority and to kitsch through its usage, quite literally, as the pillar of society, is seen here as horizontal instead of vertical. A barely visible circular groove is cut into the slab's upper surface in which a simple jeweled ring is embedded slightly off-center and just out of reach. Here the marble is not the substance from which idealized forms are carved and elevated. It is the pedestal itself and the placeholder for the sentimental object, its protection and its trapping. And so a lot of the measurements or the dimensions that I considered in making it are, obviously the ring is cut to the size of my finger, and the distance between the edge of the slab and the ring is my arm, and then in various installations it's the same sort of arm's length. So yeah, the body is kind of called into it somehow, even though it's like takes on this very reductive kind of almost absent formalist quality. Oh yeah, and so there was an one-person exhibition that I did in Zurich, in which, the main feature of the show really was a soundtrack that I had made. So, it's really hard to convey that there was really loud music happening in this room, and so I made another series of these, and I don't know. I just used the site, the dimensions of the windows as a kind of like arbitrary dimension for which to cut the other slabs, and only 3 had rings in them, and the diagonal was also related to this diagonal in the space, and I guess without the music it's a bit hard to get the full meaning of the exhibition, but that's it.
Hello. Would like to say hello to everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for Ruba for inviting me to the panel, and thank you for my peers here, and of course to everyone here in the Jewish Museum. I'm gonna read something, and I have a lot of images. I hope you enjoy them, and I'm gonna try to synchronize the images with the text. It's going to be a little bit complicated, but I hope not to fail that much. I want to start to talk about Litzwang. Litzwang is a series of abstract watercolors I've been doing for the last 15 years. There's almost 400 of them right now. And each work in the series investigates a specific problem, and I try to avoid as much as possible any repetition. in the kind of formal or conceptual problems I'm putting to myself. No? I spent almost 4 years making these drawings, only these drawings, from '92 to 2002. And almost any single idea that I later further explored in any other medium came through this series. To work with color, layers, variations, permutations with temporal structures or loops with the structures themselves all come at that time. Most of the work in the series follow some simple rules that also introduce chance and randomness in the process. So for example, always to play with the grit of the paper, or that each stain lasts for 3 sheets. So for example, here in the second sheet, you can see this small brown vertical line appearing, and it lasts for 3 sheets, then disappears. But then you have this small green appearing, and then in the very last one, for example, you have the horizontal red stripe that you also have it in the first 2. So basically, the group forms a loop, and it can be installed starting from any of the watercolors that form it. While looking at it, one kind of makes its own animation in its head. So there's a kind of a phenomenological dance, no, in the mind of the person while looking at them. Well, they are quite blurred. It's a pity, but I think you can get a sense. Each set in the series is about 6 feet wide. That is almost my tallness. So you have a cross between the horizontality of the drawings and the verticality of the viewer's body. When I was making these watercolors in Spain, I forgot to say I'm Spanish, but I live in Brazil. When I was making these drawings in Spain, I was thinking a lot about process of phenomenological apprehension. And for me, they were really related to the body and the movement, as the body is related to linguistic forms. This is something that was very difficult for me to explain in Spain, but when I went to live in Brazil, everyone understood. I was showing the drawings and saying like, yeah, you know, but these drawings, they relate to the body and the movement, and they were like, oh yeah, sure. And I was like, what, do you get that? They said, like, yeah, we know that, no? So that was like a really nice surprise, of course, no? Of course, Brazilian neo-concrete traditions helped a lot with this understanding of what I was trying to do. No? If you came to the first iteration of other primary structures, you might remember this piece by Willis de Castro. Willis de Castro is an amazing artist, really, really humble, really simple. He made these pieces, objetos activos, active objects, starting in '59 and continued through all his life. He installed them perpendicularly to the wall, so they require the viewer to move around the object, because both sides are a little bit different, but somehow connected through like a single piece of like a little teeny square that jumps from one side to the other. No? I was very impressed when I knew about this work when I went to live in Brazil in 2004. I didn't know it before. I think it's amazing how he made such a sharp phenomenological statement with such a primary structure, not trying to say or represent anything, but just being a presence in relation to the viewer's own presence. I'm myself very worried with the presence of the viewer in my shows, and how his body reacts, the time spent, the space and his movement in relation to the artwork and the own artwork presence and reality. When I did the exhibition Phasmids in Sao Paulo, I played with what the gallery newly renovated space, immediately asked you to do, having a big, tall, and sun-lit front space and a small, darker room in the back kind of feel obvious to have 1 or 2 sculptures in the middle, some wall works in the walls, and some video in the smaller, darker room. The exhibition revolved along this film I made, where some stick insects, you can see the stick insects here diagonally, are wandering through some sceneries. Some of them are much more organic and realistic, and some of them are much more geometric and abstract. And bueno, everything revolved around this film, no? And I staged the exhibition to follow and contradict the demands of the demands I felt the space was asking, no? So basically, the sculpture was like a drawing, like a spatial drawing. The video had really strong sculptural qualities, and the bidimensional pieces on the wall were actually three-dimensional holograms of branches and small sculptures, and sometimes even with a stick insect on them. No? I tried to make like a dense web and pollution of meaning between the pieces, and to dematerialize the artworks in the execution of the relations you can establish among them. And I think there's a moment where the exhibition kind of dissolves, and the viewer is not anymore looking at the pieces themselves, but maybe at its own movement or whatever. And I think this is the moment where things could start to happen. Besides the stick insects, that is an animal that I really love, there's another small animal in Brazil that has been really important to me. At the very same time that Willis de Castro was making his objetos activos, Elio Itizica started his relevos espaciales, and Lisa Clark made her first bicho. Well, if you have a point and you expand this point, you get a line. And then if you expand the line, you get a surface, okay? And this, if you expand the surface, you get a volume, no? But if you want to flip the surface, you are in the two-dimensional space, you have to go through a three-dimensional space and then back to the bidimensional. Similarly, if you want to transform a three-dimensional object, you have to go through a fourth-dimensional space and then back to the mere three-dimensional one. So I was thinking, what should be this fourth dimension? An easy explanation will be to say it's time, but modern physics knows since Einstein that the space and time are only necessary conditions for movement. And movement encompasses a body in space and time, and it's basically relational. That's in fact the fundament of the theory of relativity, the relationality. So the fourth dimensionality of the object is basically the relationality that enables a process of mutual transformation. So when you show the bichos in a vitrine or in situations where you cannot touch them, you are basically tearing apart this fourth dimensionality of the object and turning them into mere sculptures. And well, I really don't think these bichos from Lisa Clark are sculptures. Finally, I would like to show you some images of a show I did in Portugal, and talk about a little bit about some Brazilian indigenous cosmologies that have been really important for me. For my last show at Nuno Centeno Gallery in Oporto, I proposed a set of 4 curtains that you can pass through. The forms of the frames evolved from some shapes in the stick insect film as you show, trying to develop a catalog of generic forms that feel familiar or not strange at least, but you cannot relate directly to anything specific. The shapes are acted as figures and the curtain as successive backgrounds, so you were lost in a forest of figures and backgrounds that surrounded you. The visitor was able to cross the wall show through the holes in the middle of the curtains in silence, or through the chains, making the characteristic metallic noise these chains make. That was a pretty straightforward way for me to deal with notions of corporeality and uncorporeality, movement, and phenomenological interaction with the work. Brazilians have incredibly rich cosmologies. No? In their ontological understanding of the world, there's no such clear distinctions between subjects and objects, body and mind, or nature culture as we Westerns have. We Westerns used to think by a system of divisions and oppositions mutually excluding. So if we take the world, we divide it in the living and the non-living. The living we divide in between plants and animals. The animals we divide them in between irrational and rational animals. So finally reaching a small slice we could call humanity. Indians depart from the complete opposite precondition. For them, everything is human. This doesn't mean all are human beings, but all share its main all share humanity as its main ontological condition. So a tree, a panther, a river, a stone, all are human. This is possible because what defines you as an object or a subject for them is the point of view in which you are caught. And as everything is human, everything has its own point of view. So you are changed depending who is watching you. So a person is very different if it's looked by its child, by one of his pairs in a ritual where divinities are incorporated, by a panther he looks used as food, or for a spirit he looks used as a vessel he can go in. So you are a subject and an object or a divinity or food, depending on the point of view you are catch in each moment. And I think it's really relevant to think about these cosmological indigenous ideas in this context, because if there are not any more fixed objects and subjects, there's no more any more viewers and artworks, but just dynamic relations of mutual transformation. And I think this is a really, really nice way to think about art. And this is all what I want to say.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for your presentations. I'm going to start us off with like a kind of big question, and then we can go from there. I really just wanted to touch on this idea that a lot of minimalist artists were working with, which was a notion of neutrality, anonymity in relation to using industrial materials. And since your work, for the most part, everyone here's work deals with some sort of industrial material, I just wanted to think through how you would consider the cultural, political connotations of these materials in terms of producing content within the work. I think Allyson had a pretty clear example of the bricks, that she's the post World War II bricks, and sort of how that impacts or informs your work, if it's something you consider at all. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe you can start, and then, yeah.
Sure. I think it's something that I consider on several different levels. On the first level, thanks, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. It's like there's something flashing behind me. The first level, I mean, one thing I didn't mention when I addressed my work was the fact that I think about time a lot. And I think of the work as kind of four-dimensional instead of three-dimensional. I mean, not to sound too pretentious, but I do to a certain extent. And I'm a kind of an ancient world nerd, right? I mean, I just get really, really excited by the ancient world and building traditions from, the Bronze Age through the Classical Age, through Romans, through, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I think about when I visit old building sites, ruined sites, is that you see that the architecture and the sculpture are made of the same materials. And that is, for me, was kind of a really profound difference between contemporary sculpture and architecture and ancient or older sculpture and architecture. I mean, you don't even have to go so far back to find that kind of, you can look at Gothic cathedrals or something, it's all made from the same stuff. So that was always really interesting to me. I was like, well, when and why and how did that happen, where those architecture and sculpture kind of, split apart into their own, spheres or spheres of influence, or own little universes, own material traditions? Where did that diverge? And what would happen if I tried to kind of bring it back together, to try to make sculpture from contemporary architectural materials, from drywall, from cinder blocks, from bricks, from, I'm not terribly interested in kind of high-end architectural materials. I'm more interested in the kind of DIY stuff that you might pick up yourself, and the stuff that kind of regular folks might use to make architecture on their own. So that's kind of one level for me. And the other one is, when I produce a piece in another place that's not here. I make a lot of my work in New York, but I also, have produced work for other places, in other places. It's always really important for me to work with whatever the local kind of colloquial materials are, to make it's not about for me, my like American architectural materials. It's not about my American architectural materials. I'm more interested in the kind of vernacular architectural materials of a particular place. So when I was in Switzerland last summer, I went to the contractor, the masonry supply place, and this is what was there. This is what was there that fit my sort of idea, fit my budget, fit my idea for the sort of forms I wanted to create. I thought I could work with it physically, like it seemed possible, et cetera. So there's a lot of practical concerns, actually, with that. But yeah, I'm interested in kind of bringing the local architecture and local sculpture into a kind of similar material vocabulary. That's good, right? Okay.
I'd actually be interested in hearing, because I don't know what artists of that era would say to that question, because it seems to me my understanding of minimalism is that, or the understanding of the art that we call minimalism now, is that people were using manufactured and sort of industrial materials in this sort of effort to cleanse the affect of any personal expression, and it's not so much about the social materials as much as like the kind of emotion that they carry, or the kind of analytical effect that they can then enact as objects in a space with you, i.e. very little, so that the encounter becomes the content of the work. So, that's how I understand. I don't know, like, you guys educate me, because I don't know. I think there's a lot being said now about, like, I remember reading at some point an essay about, the history of the specific car paint that Don Judd used in sculptures, and, the sort of like, sort of applying how we think about art now to the artwork then. But I'm really sort of curious, like, if there were those sort of considerations at the time. It feels, maybe in the Q&A you guys can explain this to me. But in terms of thinking about that affect of sort of blankness, which I think is, this exhibition explores in really interesting ways, because blankness means so many different things when it's originating from different places, and making work like this, monoha versus, that kind of way of working, if I can like think about the industrial vocabulary as a way of creating an emotional affect within the work, that's something that I'm very, very interested in myself, in sort of maintaining, because I think it creates, for me in my work, I'm most interested in, again, sort of deflecting. Of course, there's an object in front of you that you have to deal with, whether or not, in my case, it's a photo or a video or a sculpture. There's something in the space with you, but for me, what's most important is what happens in the encounter with that thing. So having a very blank, very open, very generic, aggressively generic language, for me, is a way to ensure that the content of the work stays in the phenomenon, from the experience of it, So that's how I would answer that question, which is to say that I don't think about it so much. I make sculptures of ash, and people are like, oh, so like it's like a funeral, it's a relic. I'm like, no. Yes. I don't sort of discount or read of that, but I really am thinking, I don't think about it in those ways myself. Anyhow, what do you think?
I kind of align with Allyson a lot as far as being interested in sort of ancient forms and ancient history and those kind of, so to get back to your question about the materials that were being used, yeah, I agree. Like, the types of materials that we're using, sort of like have an ethics, or they say a lot about the culture that we are. So, you know, the first people made things out of stone, and they're still around. And then the Romans they ran out of stone, so they had to make a way to make fake stone, and they invented concrete to expand their empire. And then we, you know, now we make things with plastic. And I think kind of to get to what you were saying about like sort of what these artists, how these artists would have answered that question from back in the day. I feel like using these sort of new, at the time, very new sort of industrial materials, to them they were really interested in looking towards the future. I was reading the exhibition catalog, the original one, and the curator said that like these artists were inspired by technology and the future.
Space age technology.
Outer space. And one of the artists was quoted as saying, we're going to redesign the future. So I think it's interesting that, you know, like Allyson, particularly, and myself, are looking at these sort of ancient forms as opposed to, I don't know what that says about where we are today, looking forward as opposed to looking backwards. But,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, I think the artists probably all approach the materials in different ways, and also depending on where they're coming from in different historical and cultural contexts. So it's hard to say precisely, but I think there was an appeal to a sort of fabricated, authorless kind of material. But of course, I think we now know that, you know, all of these materials do have, and scale and issues of relationships with the bodies have specific cultural context to negotiate. And I think, you know, the relationship to technology is an important one, and something that I think would be interesting, since most of you do incorporate new technologies or different technologies, or conversely, there's like an archival element in which it's really about, you know, I think, Erin, some of your work too, it's about sort of representing something as well as enacting something, and the different kinds of sort of 2D, 3D, 4D space in which that happens.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I guess I'm curious as to where you can like locate blankness and neutrality, like as a actual category, because I feel like, say like with the marble, I mean, I inherited, I mean, that was something that was offered to me. Like, I didn't go out and choose it. It's sort of, the collector chose me. The patron was like, will you? And I feel like I was almost dealing with the sign value or the symbolic register of like what that represents, like, you know, across class even, like, to some, it's like really opulent and beautiful and expensive. I mean, it is expensive, but then there are things, or like interiors that use it that you would, like one would think was, you know, tacky or vulgar. And so I guess, yeah, and so when we talk about blankness and like, I don't know how you can strip down like an object or a manufactured thing to its like neutral core, and that's just, I get, yeah.
I think that.
I don't think blankness, I don't conflate those two.
Oh.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the big differences between like us working now and maybe some of the things that were aspired to previously. Oh, thanks. Sorry, you all heard me, right? Yeah. I think it's sort of the differences between like, you know, us kind of consciously working now and the things that were maybe aspired to previously in previous generations. I'm not sure. That's just a hypothesis. But one of the things that I did notice looking at the two shows together, like looking at the old show in reproduction and at the amazing, amazing dollhouse, incredible, and in conjunction with seeing both parts of the new show, they were like, I think it speaks to what you're talking about here, but there were some like really stark differences between Yen's show and Kynaston McShine's show, or the way I perceive the McShine show. In that the original show seem to use an incredible amount of applied color versus this show, which seems to use kind of native color that's inherent to the materials, like the materials' actual colors. But if you look at the model of the original show, almost everything is painted. And almost nothing is painted in the new show. And if it is, it's painted, white or something. Well, not that that's more neutral, but, anyway. And then also, there's like really sharp differences in the different types of geometries, I think, that were used between the two shows. Like in the original show, the geometry seemed much softer and kind of a little bit more, not arbitrary, but subjective and pop, kind of. There was a lot more like curlicues and crazy waves and things like that. Whereas in the newer version of the show, things are harder and cleaner and seem more in relationship to architecture or the kind of somewhat. But then particularly about the materials was the thing I really noticed, in that in the original show, a lot of the materials seem invisible and transformed. And in this show, they're not. It's like truth to materials. Materials are visible. It's like material qua material, very much in Jens's show. And I'm curious as to the shows are great, right? We love them. This new show is fantastic. And I'm wondering if my first impression was that it felt so much more contemporary. Like it really felt like a more contemporary show than when I looked at images from the old show, which seemed shockingly kind of kitschy in a way. Some of the works were like kind of wacky, and this show seems very austere. And I don't know. I was really surprised by for me, there were really big differences between the work that was shown in the two shows. And I wonder if it's symptomatic of some sort of, obviously it's a contemporary take on the past, right? It's not the actual past. It's a contemporary view of the past. So I wonder how much that is informing it. And if some of the things we're talking about as artists, where there is, the lack of material neutrality and things like that, if that actually came into play in the curation or anything. It's just a question. It's not an answer.
Does anyone want to try and answer that question?
If Jens was here.
Well, yeah, I had the same experience seeing the show. I think that it is a contemporary show. It's a contemporary show of curation, curating this work from the very near past. And I had sort of the same revelation when looking at the work, because we're used to seeing it in black and white photos. And then you find out that it was actually painted, these bright colors, and like you mentioned, the sort of kitschy curlicue shapes. And I think also, I think a part of that is this show's contemporariness. It's this contemporary taste curating this work from the past, whereas in the past, it was, they were still kind of figuring it all out, right?
And we've got it all figured out.
Well, there's artists from the original show that maybe you are not as familiar with as somebody like Donald Judd. And so there's this editing that happens in history as it moves forward. And I think that, this feels more like a contemporary show because it is, and the curlicues maybe weren't included because those aren't as contemporary.
Well, it's also interesting to think about how these original works were dealing with exhibition space too, and I think it's really nice that this show is happening in the same space with different works and different artists, but still sort of showing a different relationship between art objects in relation to exhibition spaces and the transformation of exhibition spaces since that time in which they're made for this, made for large scale works. And that's something that, I think might be interesting to consider, in which a sort of physical relationship to these works may have changed our relationship to them, and an unfolding in time, and how that's impacted by really, changes in architectural structures, but also even digital technology and just the way that our bodies relate to physical space.
Yeah. I think the installation with the backdrops, you think about Fried's complaint about minimalism being theatrical.
Right.
It's so theatrical in there right now with like the literal backdrops behind the sculptures. But I thought it was so fascinating reading in the book about how people were, oh, I don't know where you're going to ever show this work. There's never, do you remember that point in the interview? Yeah, they're just like, well, these sculptures are really big. Who on earth is ever going to buy these things? And it's kind of amazing to see how much, in 50 years, things have shifted so completely. And I agree, how our body relates to volumes like that, how accustomed we are to spectacle or to being dominated by objects in galleries. But also, I think my sense is that we're less adept at dealing with physical objects now than they were.
I was surprised to hear how many of us use it, or the actual measures of our own bodies to decide the stuff of the pieces. No, like you saying, no, this is just the size of my arm, or the sculptures are your height. The drawings are also my height, but horizontal. I guess Charles also mentioned. And I don't know, I was thinking while Ruba was making her question about how this can be even a way to sexualize an industrial material, no? Or something that is kind of just, there's no material, there's no neutral material, no? Its material comes with a status, with a value, even an economical value, no? But I don't know. I would like to hear you talking a little bit more about that.
Me?
All of you, actually.
Well, and also, I think maybe Carissa, you could jump in too, just in terms of also having, this particular relation to the body and this thing that's obstructed, but is also indicated through its trademark with the Cartier Love ring. I don't know, and your relationship to body and sort of, it's also a very gendered work that references minimalist sculpture as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts about.
Well, yeah, I think it's gendered in a kind of indirect way, by putting this kind of almost cliched gesture of this ring, and having if you want this fetishistic object, you're going to have to contend with this burden of bulky material, weight, and just how that's kind of, so could you specify the question more?
Just, more in relation to this kind of branding of material, but also a relationship to the body. I don't know. If you have any
Well,
thoughts.
I chose the ring because, I was just thinking about a lot of contemporary sculpture that fuses, pedestals as part of the work, and I guess assisted ready. And incorporates a lot of things from the world that are usually from the realm of the cheap and the low. I don't know. I can think of say Rachel Harrison, for example, where the sculptures are narrative, and there's a series of different found objects that will tell something kind of funny or cryptic, or but a lot of how these cheap materials are somewhat elevated into the realm of art through these juxtapositions. And I was curious as to what would happen if you take something from a different register altogether, something that was almost vulgar or cheesy or almost sentimental or potentially embarrassing, the ring, for example. So, that was the choice for that. But yeah, the physicality of it is really just, it echoes some of the minimalist tendencies, but I think I was doing it in a more, in almost a deliberately misunderstanding of it way. you know, not like the total direct, you know, logical step after that. Do you know if that makes any sense? It's kind of like maybe more in drag somehow. Like it's not a feminine or masculine object. It's just sort of like,
It's minimalism and drag.
what's that?
Minimalism and drag.
I didn't mean to say
I like that, though. Maybe we should move to some questions from the audience. I don't know if anyone has any.
Thank you, everyone. I'll ask a kind of really obvious question, which is sparked by Erin's comment about the way in which that comment of in the original catalog, like, oh, who is going to buy these things? What's gonna happen to these sculptures? And I mean, I'm just interested in asking the panel some sort of open-ended question around the discourse between sculpture and site specificity, sculpture and installation, and the sense in which, in a way, that's the interesting thing looking at the model and the images that are reproduced as backdrops in the exhibition, the sense of seeing these as objects that are in a space, that do funky things, but are maybe not yet so self-conscious about their own relationship to that space, not so self-conscious as to say, this is a thing that breaks the boundary of it, or that is extremely difficult to transport, or that requires changing the physical frame of the space in order to be accommodated. And I'm just curious what that turn does, and what, you know, that's kind of my non-question question.
Could you phrase that as a question?
Let's try Jeopardy style. I guess the question would be, I mean, I guess I'll just keep riffing for no more than 30 more seconds, hopefully, which is just to say that, like, I thought, Allyson, your response was interesting to the question of how there is something that's kind of fun and loopy about the original kind of show in a way. It's a thing that we don't get from the black and white photographs, because a black and white photograph always allows you always project onto it. You're not seeing the thing. Any installation photography does that, but it's just the sense of the playfulness of it as opposed to the desire to kind of thwart its own physicality. Phrased as a question, I'll just ask, like where does one go? Like in a way, where does one go with the kind of desire to kind of constantly transform spaces themselves, and whether that's something that's of concern to you guys as artists?
But transforming spaces is really fun. I mean, that's kind of, I kind of think a lot of the time, that's maybe my first thought oftentimes when I start to work on something. So for me, it's not a thing to avoid or a thing that I should be wary of, but it's actually oftentimes my starting point. And I'm not making grand transformations, but I actually oftentimes, when I'm working on a show, I always look at the floor plan, like first, before I have any ideas for the show. I look at floor plan and photographs, and I build a model, and a digital model that I kind of look through and try to feel the space. Because for me, it's actually pretty hard at this point. And I understand you're saying that, like, this is a new thing, right? And maybe they were less they weren't as self-conscious about this as I am, but I'm profoundly self-conscious about the space that I work in, maybe to a fault where it's hard to kind of shift things from place to place sometimes. But then you just change the piece, if you have to do it in a new place.
I think it's a really cool observation, though, Pram, because it's such an awkward presentation of those sculptures in the dollhouse. Things are jammed together. There's an Ellsworth Kelly like a foot away from a wall. It's like, if you think of Dia Beacon as sort of the apex of how this work is to be installed perfectly, it's a huge jump from there to here. So it's kind of a really nice historical piece that I hadn't really thought about in terms of thinking about how that work was first interacted with by the public. This gift of thinking about the space is something that we can thank those artists for, but that's something that obviously wasn't forefront.
Yeah,
in the
it looks like a bunch
designers.
of wingdings.
Yeah, actually kind of literally in some cases.
Literally like wingdings, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that speaks to their influence. in that I kind of had the same experience reading about how big the sculptures were and thinking, well, they're not that big. But, except for maybe like the Grosvenor or whatever. But that, you know, I mean, those artists are, you talked about Dia Beacon. I mean, those artists were the ones who, that's why we needed to build Dia Beacon. That's why we needed Chelsea, so we could have these huge gallery spaces to show this work. So it kind of speaks to their massive influence on how they did remake the future. They remade the art world. So yeah, that just kind of.
But do you see that as like shifting the critical intention of the work to sort of challenge a space? I mean, I think in the project you did at JTT too, it was kind of an interesting example of really like doing something that really contained the space and pushed against it in a particular way.
So you're asking, were they trying to challenge the
I mean,
space?
I know that
or-
they were trying to sort of challenge these spaces and really push against the architecture, but which was part of like a critical project. But then now they have, you know, sort of spaces change. So how does that sort of impact
Right.
the production of that or the intention of that work?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, for one, that's what's interesting about what's happening in the Lower East Side now, where I feel like, so these guys kind of changed the art world to be sort of huge and massive and giant hangar spaces. And it's interesting now that we have galleries downtown and they're sort of like in this like living environment where you can be walking to an art gallery and then go past like a cafe or whatever. It kind of, as I don't know what it means politically or anything like that, but just, or economically, but it just sort of makes the gallery experience a little more like human scale when you go downtown to see art. I think that's another interesting thing about the original Primary Structures show, just walking around and seeing sort of the photographs and then the other primary sculptures installed here. You see these like really elaborate architectural flourishes of this museum. And that's sort of how people used to see art, like salon style and these like really ornate gallery spaces uptown. And so as we had to build these sort of like white cube spaces to accommodate this like minimalist work, we got away from having these architectural spaces that could really add something to the sculpture. So all that's to say that it's interesting to see this minimalist work in a space before all the spaces became minimalist, I guess.
It seems too like the thing that's affected our understanding and how we relate to the work of this time period is just how thoroughly the aesthetic has been absorbed by absolutely every aspect of our life. Like the minimalist aesthetic of IKEA, like we all live in some sort of little ad hoc minimalist environments on some level probably. And I think like, and how much that's become like the sort of like social connotations of having clean lines in your living room and like what the experience of Dia Beacon is really meant to be, like how people sort of interpret that aesthetic when they go to see this work now, you know.
But when you were talking about future, when Charles mentioned that, I mean, it's like the interface of Apple is pretty much
Yes.
you know, minimalism. But anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Does it reduce minimalism to a style? Probably. Does it make us sort of, does it kind of confuse our understanding of what those works were actually sort of achieving? Probably, because the way we can relate to them now is only through reproduction. Like, I think it's like rife for misunderstanding. And I, you know, no. I just wonder about, I always wonder anyhow generally about the ability to have a direct experience with a work that's been made in the past. It kind of feels like a fool's errand, but it's always something that I sort of aspire to and think about a lot. You know, not seeing something as a historical document, not trying to reinterpret it, not try to look at it with eyes from now. I mean, it's kind of a useless, futile exercise, but I'm trying to see if I can have some direct experience, whatever that means, you know? And this kind of work is sort of begs that, I feel like, but it's exceptionally difficult because of all of this other stuff. Maybe that's obvious, but.
I think we have time for one more audience question, if there is one.
Sorry, I'll come back to you. And I don't know what's going on with our sound system. They're on it, but sorry about that.
Okay, so I was a bit interested in seeing all your presentations of work on the panel. The sort of difference between reproduction and mimesis and how that functions in the work that you're all making. I know in the whole survey of everything that you guys shown, different people have different ways of experiencing that. Daniel, your work is more phenomenological or about phenomenon. Carissa, your work is about these sort of social mechanisms, the gift exchange. Charles, you're about materiality. But even as a wider question to this show, other primary structures as a reproduction or a mimetic reinterpretation of something, what's the transformative potential of reproduction versus mimesis? Period.
I think
Question mark, sorry, actually. Thanks, Brad.
Add question mark.
Exclamation
I
point.
think reproduction is another way of existence of the piece, of the work. As when someone comes to you and tells, "Oh, I saw this amazing show by this guy, and he did that and that," and sometimes you never got to see the work, but it gets a real influence into you, no? Because I don't know, the image you made in your head, it's been influential. Sometimes you get to know the original work finally, and then you get kind of disappointed. It's like, oh my God, my idea was much better. and sometimes you get to the original work, and it's exactly the same thing you imagine. No? Even the guy just gave 2 words about that. No? And yeah, I don't know, going to the Beacon, I think it's a surprise to everyone, no? Especially if you only know these works by reproduction, and then you get to know the size of them. No? The actual size, they are really big. You know? All of them, the wall drawings, they are installed just right now. They are 6 meters tall. No? They are amazingly beautiful. And but I'm really worried about these different stages of existence of the work. No? So you have an idea of the work, and it's an start of the work being in the world. No? I guess if you tell your idea to a friend, to a peer, like, oh, I want to do that, no? And then, oh yeah, do it. It's fantastic. No? So this is how starts things. I don't know. Probably you cannot have a baby without talking about having a baby. No? So the pregnancy stamps there.
How can you follow that up?
Is that a good spot to end, maybe? Okay, well, thank you all of the panelists for being here, and thank you everyone for being in this conversation with us.
Thanks.
Thanks.